Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to our July office hours. My name is Sherry Brown, and I am a longtime member of the marketing team at Bic Gardner USA and Pelham Gardner. And today we will have a presentation by Noah Morgan, our application specialist, on visual color analysis. And as you can see from the slide, visual color control of solid colors. This presentation format, if you haven't attended before, is about 20 minutes of presentation, and then we open it up to Q&A. And so it's really to allow you to answer questions for you. Anything you have to ask, Noah will be happy to help answer. And if we don't get to any of your questions, we will follow up with them afterwards. If there's any questions in regards to the audio, you can certainly see that in the chat. I put some information in there, as well as we are recording this and we have started the recording. You will receive a copy of the recording link after the presentation. So just look for that. And at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Noah. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sherry. Thank you all for joining. So today we're going to talk about visual control of solid colors. So why do we want this? Because often customers assume, they associate consistency with quality. So we really want to make sure that when we're manufacturing materials or products, they're always going to be consistent in color. That way the consumer sees that, they're consistent, so they're quality, and I want to buy this. So right off the bat, I'm going to start with a nice optical illusion. So if you see here, there's a blue section on the left side, and there's a blue section on the right side. So when looking at this, the blue on the right side looks a little bit lighter than the blue on the right side. So you can see an obvious difference between those two colors with all these lines in between. So when I switch the slide, now you see that that blue was actually the same color. So this kind of tells us that, environmental aspects could change how we see a color. So if there's something around the environment or other variables in the situation, it could change how we see it. And so this is important because, a lot of different variables happen when we're looking at colors. Our perception is subjective, so it can change based off of our age, our gender, our mood. A lot of times when people are angry, they say, I see red. Or if someone's sad, they say, I'm feeling blue. So, that's an example of how, we can change how we're seeing something based off of how we're feeling. And you also have to remember viewing and illumination conditions could affect how we're seeing something. So depending on the type of light, where the light's coming from, this could all affect how we're seeing something. We cannot communicate nor remember colors. So that's saying, basically, if I had two very similar pastel color samples, and I had them next to each other, and then I separated them and walked away and came back, I wouldn't really be able to tell which one was which based off of my memory, because it's such a hard thing to understand with the shades. Color is also dependent on the surrounding light and on the background. So we just saw that in that previous slide where we had the yellow stripes and how that affected that blue color. It seemed a lot lighter than it actually was. So it's important to know that when we're trying to evaluate something, there's a lot of different variables that are playing into the situation. And so objective methods are needed for a really accurate color evaluation. All right, so this is one of the other variables is the lighting situation. So, before outside lighting using daylight was recommended as one of the best ways to view colors, because the wavelengths in daylight include all the colors in the spectrum evenly, whereas indoor lighting is very subjective based on what type of light. If you have a fluorescent light, it's very dominant in the blue spectrum. So outside evaluation was recommended, but outside evaluation can change depending on the weather or what time of day it is. And the example here, noon and sunset, there's two different, the light's completely different out there. A clear day versus a cloudy day, completely different situations. A color could seem, more red maybe at noon or sunset because of the sun setting over the clouds. And then during direct daylight, midday with clear skies, it might seem less red, So we've kind of moved towards indoor lighting. That way we can keep it consistent. I talked before about the fluorescent lamps. There's tungsten lamps, which dominate more in the red spectrum, and then LEDs. And the thing is, they're better because we can control them more, but these lights may vary between different manufacturers. So we come across that issue. So from there, we were able to come up with standards that could be across the board and kind of keep everything more consistent. So you see here the international standards for visual evaluation of solid colors. This was created by CIE, which is a French company or a French institution. And you see here, so we have the ISO 3668, ASTM D1729, the DIN 6173, and the SAEJ 361. So all these are just standards to follow when observing light visual or observing color visually comparing. And you see across the board, they all use their main illuminance as D65, which is daylight at 6,500 lumens. It keeps it consistent across the board. And then you see some of them measure for metannerism here as well, except for DIN. And we'll talk a little bit more about metannerism later on. You can see their level of illumination they call out in the standards. They're mostly around the same in lux. And then you'll see what's interesting is that the color of the interior that they call out for in these standards are all pretty much the same. It calls out for a matte neutral gray color. And this is because that background color can play a role in how we're going to see that color. So they wanted to make sure that everything remains neutral so that we can see what we're really seeing. And then the gloss of the interior is called out in the ASTM. It's 60 degrees. It's calling for less than 15 gloss units, which makes sense with the other ones being matte gray. It's almost around the same thing. And then another important thing to note is the diffuser panel. So it's calling out for a diffuser panel, so it's not direct light that's being cast on these samples. So here we kind of get into the illuminants. So these are the CIE standard illuminants. So we start out with D65, which is one of the most commonly used ones. It stands for daylight at 6,500 lumens, as I said before. And you can see the spectral curve of that light source there, where it's almost even across the board on all those colors of the spectrum. So there's no real dominant. You could say blue might be slightly more dominant, but it's going to cast all those colors on that sample evenly. Whereas you see in the A light, which is a tungsten light bulb, you can think of that like in your house, the warm light, it's very dominant on the red side. So if you have a blue sample, it's not going to be as vibrant as it would in the D65 or the F2 light. So these illuminants can play a role. And then our last one is F2, which is our fluorescent light. And this is usually in office buildings, department stores. And you can see with that fluorescent light, which I'm sure all of you have seen before, blues are very dominant. Blues and greens are very dominant in this light source. So if you have a red shirt on, it might, in a fluorescent light, it might seem a little muted versus if you have it in a tungsten light. So all these different illuminants can play a role. So it's important that we can be able to establish what illuminants are standard, which ones are always going to be used. So like I spoke on before, metamerism is an important thing to look at when you're using these different illuminants, and also when you're producing things. So you can see here these samples. So you have a sample and a standard. Under D65, you can see both of those, that sample and that standard, they match perfectly. But then when you put a tungsten light in there, when you cast that tungsten light over that sample, they start to mismatch, which can be a problem, when you're producing things and a customer purchases it in a department store and they take it home under their warm home lighting and it looks completely different. That's a big issue. So we got to look at metamerism, and what it basically is when something matches under one light source, but under another light source, it's completely different. And the reason behind that is because of the pigments that sample is made out of might be a little different to that standard. So when it's put into its final form, it's going to look completely different under that light. And so you can see in the curves of that standard, which is the dotted line, it's a little higher in the blue area, and that goes down in the red zone there. And the sample is the same thing, but it's slightly off. It's not a huge deal. But then when we look at it under those lights, we can actually see this difference. That's when it becomes a problem. So you want to look at your products under different lighting in order to figure out if this is going to be an issue for you or not. And this is an example that's a little bit better at explaining it. So if you have that sample and that standard, they both match under that D65. And then when you look at it under that fluorescent light, they're both going to match there because that fluorescent light's dominant in the blues, so it's going to show these blues being very bright. Not very bright and dominant. But when you look at it under the tungsten light, which is very dominant in the red, you're going to see this slight difference occur. So that's what we want to avoid. So this is kind of like a standard if you don't have all the products to do so, like a light booth. This is what you should follow for viewing colors and comparing. First off, you want to try and find a north-facing window. This is so you can get optimal sunlight. That's not direct sunlight, so it's kind of diffuse sunlight. Uncluttered neutral surroundings. So you want to have neutral surroundings, say like your shirt. You don't want to wear a bright yellow shirt because it could affect the way light's reflected off your shirt onto that sample. You want to have usually a white, black, or gray. Sometimes black is even not preferred. Usually it's gray and some darker whites. Specimens should physically touch each other. So what that's saying is that these specimens should be touching. If you have a separation between them, you might not be able to see the color difference as you would if they're touching each other. If you ever been to a paint store and you're looking at different paint swatches to paint a wall, if you look at them separately, sometimes you can't even see the difference. But when you put them together and they're on top of each other or they're next to each other, you can start to see a slight difference. And then illumination, 45-0 viewing perpendicular or vice versa. What that's saying is it's calling out for a 45-0 or 0-45 viewing angle, which basically is where either you're looking directly above the sample and the light's coming in from a 45-degree angle, and it's to avoid the specular reflection. That way you're not just seeing the reflection of the sun on your eyes. And you can go vice versa where the sunlight's directly overhead and you're viewing from a 45-degree angle. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And you can see a major problem that comes from this is the source of light's not consistent. If it's an overcast day, it may not be the same as a clear sky day. All right, so this is the 45-0 or 0-45 viewing angle. Just a little description of it. So you can see here, you're viewing from 45 degrees, and the illumination is coming from 0, so directly overhead onto the sample, so that the specular reflection is coming right back at the illumination. And the reason behind this is we want to avoid that specular reflection, because if we just see that specular reflection, or you could say gloss, if we just see that gloss or reflection from the sun, it's just going to hit us in the eyes, and all we're going to see is white instead of seeing what the actual color of the sample is. And then, you could do it vice versa, where you're looking directly overhead when the sun or illuminate's coming in from a 45-degree angle, and we're still going to be avoiding that specular reflection, which is what we want. All right, so we kind of see, a development of parameters to follow. And so what we see is a defined light source. So we have D65A, which is the tungsten light, the warm light, F2 and F11, which are different fluorescent lights. And we want to use diffused illumination, so no direct illumination going right at the sample. We want something that's more diffused. If you're doing an outside evaluation, you want to do it in midday hours instead of doing it at noon or at dusk. A viewing distance of 500 millimeters, which correspond to a 10-degree observer. So that's just saying 500 millimeters is around arm's length. You don't want to keep it real far away, because sometimes we're not able to distinguish colors when they're very far away versus when we're closer to them. And then you want to keep your illumination perpendicular to the viewing 45 degrees or vice versa. So that 45-0 or 0-45 viewing angle. And when we're describing the colors, we want to use the terms hue, chroma, and lightness to describe. That way we can be descriptive when we're talking to, customers, or we're talking to other color scientists. So the same across the board. And then something to be aware of is in viewing color, it should be viewed by a trained and experienced person. So someone that's been, viewing colors, and they know what to look for and how to do it. You want to avoid eye fatigue effects. So when you're looking at a pastel color and comparing them, after looking at chromatic colors, it could affect your judgment. So you also want to have a quick decision. So you don't want to sit there and dwell on the differences between these color samples, because if you dwell about it too long, you're going to think one way, then you'll think the other. What you want is to just make a quick decision. That way you can make your best judgment off of that. Go with your gut feeling. And then you want to incorporate rest periods. So if your eyes start to get fatigued, you can feel it. You want to look at neutral gray walls to kind of relax those receptors in your eyes for a little bit. And like I said before, you want to wear neutral colored clothing, so nothing bright and chromatic that could affect the way the light's reflecting onto those samples. And then testing is recommended over 40 years. So, if you really want to get into it, you should test yourself constantly throughout the years. And then, it's best to have normal color vision, because if you're colorblind, obviously that will play an effect in how you're going to view these colors. All right, so this slide is pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is I want everybody to look at this white dot in the middle and stare at that. I'll keep it on here for maybe 15 to 20 seconds. And I'm going to show you this very interesting illusion that can show you how your eyes start to get tired of looking at a certain color and then start to show you different colors. So keep looking at that dot. I'm just going to keep it here for another 15 seconds. All right. All right, so if you're looking at it, you should see a pretty cool effect where all those colors were just switched from yellow and green and black to red, white, and blue. And so the reason behind this is, as you're looking at some colors, especially those bright chromatic colors, those receptors in your eyes start to get fatigued. And so when you go and switch over to this white screen, because they're so fatigued, your eyes are going to start seeing the colors that the receptors aren't fatigued to. So that red, white, and blue, those are the colors that your eyes are not tired. They're trying to overcompensate. And so you see this strange illusion, which is pretty interesting. So that, like I said before, it's something you want to watch out for when you're looking at colors all the time, is you want to take a break and rest your eyes. If you keep looking at these chromatic colors, eventually you keep switching, you might see something different than what's actually there. So this is one of the different color blindness testing that you can do. Ishihara test for color deficiencies. This was a test created by, I believe, a Japanese scientist, where it's basically a bunch of these different colored dots, and you're able to tell what kind of color deficiency you have in your eyes based off of what you're seeing. So there's a couple different forms of color blindness. Tetrachromacy, where only two cones are functioning, associated with red blindness or green blindness and blue blindness. And then anomalous trichromacy, where you have three cones and one cone is altered, usually a red-green deficiency. And so if you have perfect vision, you should see a 35 in this plate here, an 8 in this plate, and a 7 in this plate. And if you don't see one of those, you have some type of color deficiency. Pretty interesting. All right. This is another one of those colorblind tests. This is the Farnsworth 100 hue test. So there's two different forms of this, where it basically involves sorting different colored hues into a correct pattern. And if you sort it wrong, there's a scoring system based off of how you perform the test that'll determine the type of color blindness that you have. So like it says, discern small color differences, preferred method for anyone performing critical color decisions. People involved in QC, harmony reviews, and color matching. They have a test frequency and environment they use. So this gets to one of our instruments that we sell, the BICO Basic and the BICO Mini, to help reduce the risk of metamerism. And what it is, it's just a benchtop light booth that it's the small version, and it's for smaller samples where you can use daylight, incandescent A light, and the fluorescent lights interchangeably. That way you can look at a sample and a standard and make sure that they're matching under each of these illuminants like we spoke of before. And so it's got easy operation. It's got 3 switches, so you can switch in between. You can assemble it pretty quick, and there's a difference in size. So this is our smaller version. So it's not the large version for bigger samples. It's a nice benchtop. Okay, next slide. This is our BICO Spectra Light and BICO Spectra Standard, which are the larger versions. So you can see the samples in here. It's a little larger. And so this has 5 illuminants. So it has the D65, which is our daylight, our A tungsten light, so the warm light, the CWF and TL84, which are 2 different types of fluorescent tubing, often used in department stores. That way you can tell what the sample is going to look like at the store versus outside versus in the home. And what's also cool is it has a UV setting. So that's for fluorescent colors or fluorescent products. It's pretty cool. Comfortable handling. You could also set up sequencing, so you could have it switch between different light settings in a row, so you don't have to press any buttons. You can just sit back and watch it change colors. That way you can really tell what's changing between that. So our standard version and our light version. And then this is our BICO Spectra Pro, which can double as both a light booth and a luminaire. So a luminaire is basically just the top of the light booth, and it's suspended in a way to give it a 0-45 or 45-0, where you're looking at the sample from a 45-degree angle, and the light's directly overhead of the sample on these angled platforms. And what this is for is, for large samples. So usually it's used in automotive plants for different parts they have. They have a light booth room where they take a look at different samples that are too big to put inside of a regular light booth. And this is an example here of different Harmony rooms at some automotive plants that they have, just so they can put a car in there and kind of see all the parts that go together and see how the harmony is on all those parts. So you can put it in, daylight, what it's going to look like on the road, and you can put it under all these different light sources, what it's going to look like in the dealership, anything, which is it's really cool to be able to have a system where you can always control the lighting. Historically when they go outside, they have to make sure it's not a rainy day. If it's a rainy day, they have to wait till the next day. Whereas this allows them to do it whenever they want, any time of day. All right, so going back to the light sources. So like I spoke before, we have the D65, which is one of the best light sources because it includes almost an accurate representation of all the colors in the spectrum. We have the A-light, which has this large curve where it's very low in the blue region and the green, but it starts to get real high in the red. And then we have the fluorescent, where it's pretty low across the board, but it has these spikes in the purple, blues, and greens. This is important because with our Bico Spectra Pro, we had to come up with a way to simulate the D65 light. And so you see here the D65 light source is supposed to be this shape for the best accurate representation. And you see the CIE illuminate, they call out for standards. So we have to match these standards. And so with the Bico Spectra Pro, you can see how we follow the F2 and the A light pretty well. So everything is right where it should be. It might be slightly off, but according to the standard, it's perfect. Whereas we look over here, currently in most of the technology out there in the market, it's using a fluorescent tube to simulate daylight, which doesn't make sense, but according to the CIE standard, they're still following within that tolerance for that daylight. And they put it in classes to where this daylight is considered, this specific daylight with the fluorescent tube is considered a class BC, which means it's between the class B and the class C. So it's not super accurate, but it's accurate enough. So that's what most of the light booths on the market follow right now. But with the Bico Spectra Pro, we were able to simulate perfect daylight. So we chose different light sources and different filters. So we used a monolithic high-quality blue glass filter with a halogen lamp and a short wave range with an LED. And we were able to produce this blue line here, which you can see almost follows that CIE D65 standard to the T, compared to the normal one that was used before and by most of the industry today. It's all over the place. It's close enough to it according to the standard, but it's not perfect. Whereas this new one that we developed, it's almost right on the money. And so you can see here, this is how the CIE classifies it. So overall, we had a Class A on our Bico Spectra Pro with a combination of these filtered tungsten halogen lamps and the LEDs. And automatically the right amount of UV light was added when selecting D65. So what that's saying is it was almost perfect at simulating real daylight outside, according to the international CIE standards. And what this is good for is, for very tight tolerances, if you're looking at it under the Bico Spectra Pro, when you look at that daylight, it's actually going to be as close to daylight as possible, instead of looking at something under daylight for maybe one of the older versions. It may not be perfect, it might be slightly off. So there's always that small percentage of risk that you're taking. Whereas with this newer version, it's considered a Class A, whereas before they're considered Class B and Class C. With this Class A, it's the most accurate one. And so to show you the difference between these different classes, this is perfect daylight here, and you can see there's a slight difference in them. And then under Class A, it almost matches perfectly to what that natural perfect daylight is. And then you look over here to the Class B, and they're completely different. And so that's one way to think of it. It may be considered D65 and only a Class B, but in reality, there could be that large difference depending on those pigments being used. Whereas that Class A shows you that best representation. So that's something to really look and think about when looking at these instruments. If it's a Class A or Class B, it doesn't sound like much, but in the end, it could be a large difference. All right, so that concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And I hand it back to you, Sherry.
Thank you very much, Noah. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but please feel free to put any in there. I will, just to take a step back, that word again, it's so hard to say when the two colors look different under different light sources. What's that word again?
Yes, metamerism.
Metamerism. Yes. I know in my house, certainly my painted walls, when the sun comes in, they look different colors and different shades of light, and then you can see the dust. We won't get into that. Yes.
Yeah. Yep, that's a great representation of what it can do. Is a lot of times you'll see something, or you'll buy a T-shirt under the fluorescent department store light, and then when you go home and try it on, you're like, man, this looks completely different.
You will get the presentation directly after the webinar closes. You will get an email version with a link to the presentation and I believe the recording. And then we also put the recording up on our YouTube channel, so it will always be there then for you to view as well. Yeah. And what you did with the flag was very cool. I didn't necessarily see the red, white, and blue, but I did see the flag as more of like a solid versus seeing the colors, the green and yellow. But yes, that was really,
Yeah, you must have strong eyes. If you look at it long enough, if you put it out there for maybe 45 seconds to a minute, and then you switch over to that light side, you should see a pretty substantial difference. And it's pretty interesting the way your eyes can start to get really tired and you don't even realize it. And when you switch over, you're like, whoa, that's crazy. It's fascinating.
There was one question about the YouTube channel, and I can grab that link and put it in the chat. I think let me see if that does the link. Oh, that's doing it. I don't know if that actually put the link in there. Let me try something else for a moment. While I'm doing that, I know you had mentioned 3 terms on what you're supposed to do to subscribe.
Yes.
The terms? Yep. I don't know if you would like to repeat those.
Real quick.
Definitions for those.
in one of these slides here. Yeah, so the hue, chroma, and lightness. So the hue is the way the color changes. You can consider going left to right, and then you can think of the chromaticity as going from pure white or pure pastel to very chromatic. So if you say it has a red hue with a high chromaticity, you would think of like a bright red, almost like a fire truck. And then lightness, you could say, it's pretty much like a z-axis. So lightness, you could consider 0 being white, or 0 being black, and then 100 being white. It's just a good way of describing different colors when you're talking to multiple people. It's a good rule of thumb to follow.
Good. Thank you. Do we have any other questions or any questions that anybody would like to put in the chat? I think thank you for your comments on it being a good presentation. We certainly appreciate that type of feedback. And again, if there are any presentations or anything that you're needing help with or anything that you'd like us to ever cover, you can feel free to shoot us an email to any of our messages that we send you. We do have upcoming office hours, and we also have 60-minute presentations, which is like a full almost 45-minute presentation, which is a little bit longer, and then also allows for questions and answers for those. There's 2 different sets of those. Some are done worldwide and done by our office in Europe, and those you can register right on the website. And then there's ones that we do just here from the office in the US, and we send those out via email for you to register. But feel free to give us any feedback if you've ever liked any certain topics covered.
And just a note, if you ever have any technical questions, you can reach me at my email on the screen. It's noah.morgan@altana.com. So if you ever have any type of technical question about an instrument, about a theory, just feel free to reach out, and I'll be in contact.
And I think that might be it for today. Maybe we can wait one more second and see if anybody has any other questions, but I haven't seen any more come into the chat. So I thank you for your time today. We always appreciate when you're able to attend. And again, as Noah mentioned, we're here to answer your questions and help you solve your problems. And again, we appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.